Hello everyone, it's an honor to start with these virtual dialogues for our El Emergente series, highlighting emerging stories, histories and ideas between Australia and Latin America. My name is Rosario Rutilo, and today I'm joined by my colleague Ariel Castro Martinez. Together we are part of the Australian Latam Emerging Leaders Dialogue, an initiative that aims to build a roadmap towards strong cooperation between regions through the next generation of leaders. Today we are delighted to introduce Santiago Peña. Santiago graduated as an economist in Paraguay and studied economic policy management at Columbia University in New York City, where he obtained a master's in public administration. In 2000, Santiago joined the Central Bank of Paraguay, and in 2009 he was hired by the IMF, where he worked as an economist responsible for countries in the sub-Saharan Africa. In 2015, he was appointed Minister of Finance in Paraguay, a position he held until June 2017, when he chose to run as presidential candidate in the primaries for the Colorado Party. Santiago is currently working in the financial sector in Paraguay and contributes regularly on different projects in his home country and the region. Thank you, Santiago, for your time. We are really happy to have you here. We want to learn more about Paraguay, about the Latin American region, and of course, the links that it has to Australia. So welcome.
Thank you very much. A pleasure to be with you, and so excited to share about my home country, Paraguay. After working so many years in the public sector and promoting, in a way, Paraguay, this is something that I continue to do, regardless that I'm no longer in the public sector.
Great. Okay, so first of all, we would like to know a little bit more about Paraguay. Would you tell us about the current political economic reality and which, in your opinion, are the strengths and the challenges that the country has right now?
Yeah, first of all, I think it's very important to understand the history of Paraguay, which is very different to the rest of the countries in the region. Paraguay is a landlocked country. It's in the middle of two very large countries, Brazil and Argentina. And history has been particularly cruel with Paraguay. Last year, we celebrated 150 years of the end of the Triple Alliance War. And this is something that really marked the development of Paraguay on the following decades. And still today, trying to understand Paraguay, we need to understand where Paraguay comes from. During that time, a period of 10 years between 1860 and 1870, Paraguay went to a war against Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay. And because of that war, we lost 60% of the territory. We lost 90% of the male population. But probably what mostly affected Paraguay in the following decade is that we lost the opportunity of receiving the largest inflow of immigrants to Latin America. Between 1880 and 1920, it is estimated that Latin America, South America in particular, received almost 80 million immigrants from Europe. These immigrants brought a lot of knowledge about a lot of experience in the development of all the sectors in Latin America. And at that time, Paraguay, besides of being a landlocked country, which made it more difficult for immigrants to arrive, it was also an open grave. So it was more difficult to receive that capital, human capital that was coming to Latin America to develop all of the sectors. So when you look at the development of Paraguay in the last century, it's way behind the development of other countries in the region, right? On top of that, we have the longest dictatorship in South America for 35 years. We have the dictatorship of Stroessner, also shaped the development of institutions, particularly the democratic institutions. So it was only in the 1990s that Paraguay began a process of developing of democratic institutions, but also economic institutions. By that time, Paraguay was a mostly centralized economy, began to do a lot of reforms, liberal reforms in terms of liberalizing the economy to the private sector. They did reforms in the monetary policy of the central bank, the fiscal policy of the Ministry of Finance. And during a period of almost 30 years, there has been a process of expansion of GDP and a lot of improvement in social indicators, right? But despite that, Paraguay still is one of the countries that is less developed in South America. We have, and despite the large increase in GDP per capita over the last to decades, we still a GDP per capita, which is half of the average in South America. So the way or the space to continue to improve is very, very large. It's an open economy. It's one of the most open economies in Latin America. We do a lot of export. We are part of the Mercosur Treaty together with Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, and Venezuela. But Mercosur has been positive in some regards, but also has been negative in other regards, which I am happy to discuss further. But the economy has been very solid, very strong macro fundamentals, a very strong macro framework with an independent central bank, a fiscal policy which is run very, very healthy with low fiscal deficit and very low debt to GDP ratios. So in general, we face this economic crisis, the pandemic of the COVID-19, with a lot of resources. And in fact, Paraguay was the economy was affected the least among all the countries in South America. So we are recovering. We are expecting to grow this year 4.5%. But despite all this good news, there's still a lot of work for Paraguay to continue to improve social indicators.
That was a very good history of and an overview of Paraguay, which a lot of people might not know about. Paraguay is not on the radar of a lot of Australians, but it should be because of its fascinating history and the resilience of its people and its recent history, like in its economy. Paraguay has seen extraordinary growth in the past years, as you noted, particularly during the commodities boom of the early 2000s to 2010. However, the economy of Paraguay is a market economy, highly dependent on agricultural products, representing 30% of its GDP. Moreover, according to official figures, 5% of landowners own 90% of the land. Given the current economic structure highly depends on exogenous factors such as climate change, such as climate and international demand. How does the performance of your main trading partners, such as Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Russia, the US, affect your economy, and how could you diminish this impact, do you think?
Yeah, Ariel, many things that you have mentioned, I think it's worth mentioning all of them. One is Paraguay is a market that is not very known, and there are many reasons. History has been one of the explanations. We have a very famous writer, Augusto Roa Bastos, who described Paraguay as an island surrounded by land, because Paraguay and Paraguayans itself isolated from the rest of the region. And I couldn't be more agree with that policy, because after going to war and being killed 90% of the male population, of course, the fear of going abroad was very large. So this is something that has historical roots, has been changing. Recently, I worked in the inaugural bond of the Republic of Paraguay, issuing bonds in the international market, and meeting with investors. One of them said, Paraguay doesn't exist. I said, what do you mean? Of course it exists. And I showed the map. I said, no, let me show you why Paraguay doesn't exist. So he came up with his computer and he typed in its Bloomberg platform, it typed Paraguay. And after putting enter, it said not found. Paraguay did not exist in the international financial markets. So this is one of the strategies that we used a couple of years ago, how to put the flag of Paraguay in the international market as an indicator for foreign direct investment to come, because it was not only to bring investors from the region, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, but also from the US, Europe, and of course, Asia. So a lot of people did not know about Paraguay. When I went to college in the US, I was listening to a lecture by Professor Jeffrey Sachs, and he was talking about Latin America. And he went through all the countries in Latin America, and after 2 hours, he closed his remarks saying, the only country I'm not going to talk about is Paraguay, because I don't know nothing about Paraguay. Nothing wrong about that, but I don't know nothing about Paraguay. So this is part of the work that we have to do, Paraguayans, in talking about our country. So one of the person, Jimena, was mentioning that I am the first Paraguayan they met. And this is something that happened very often to Paraguayans. We need to be more outspoken and promote more and talk about the good things, but also the challenge that we have ahead of us. So in that line, we also have to spread the word with our own partners in terms of how can we complement Paraguayan economy with the Brazilian economy, with the Argentinian economy? Because I was mentioning, and this is related, how do we relate with our trading partner? Brazil is our largest trading partner. And despite being part of the Mercosur, which has been very positive to build an economic bloc in South America, they continue to maintain a lot of protectionist policies in terms of trade. And it's not only tariff, but also measures that make very difficult for Paraguayan products to enter the Brazilian market. We made an approach a couple of years ago trying to replicate what Mexico did with the US. And we promoted the Paraguayan market as a platform to provide more competitiveness to Brazilian industries. And we replicate through the mechanism known as Maquila. Maquila is a tax regime where you can import all the goods, you can give an added value, and you should export 90% of all the production. So you pay absolutely no taxes, and you pay only a small fee on the amount that you revenue of the total revenue that you generate. And it's very attractive. We went through from exporting 50 million in 2005 to almost 1 billion last year. And this is a sector that is expanding and is very useful for the manufacturing of wire harness for the automotive sector, textile, plastics. And the idea behind this is telling to Brazilians that they are importing from Asia $80 billion per year. 10% of that, we're talking about only $10 billion, are products that can be manufactured by Brazilian industries in Paraguay and at a much more competitive prices. So this idea of putting Paraguay as being a landlocked country, but at the end is at the heart of South America, it can access a market of almost 300 million when you take into account the 200 million plus consumers in Brazil, the 40 million plus consumers in Brazil, in Argentina, and then others in Bolivia, and you have also Colombia and Peru. This is a platform which is very attractive when you think about the macro stability, the political stability, the very attractive tax regime. So I think this is something that not all the markets know about, and this is the challenge that we have to explain this to other players in the region.
Wow, Santiago, I think that's really, really interesting. I actually didn't know about that, and I found it that it's a key to increase production.
But also, excuse me, Rosario, I don't want to miss, because the question for Ariel has many parts, and one of them is the dependence of Paraguay economy to the primary sector, to agricultural and cattle raising. And I think this has been something of a lot of debate. Because look, this is an economy that depends on primary products. Those products depend on international prices that Paraguay doesn't control, the price of soy, the price of beef. But the reality is that despite international financial institutions or banks has always promoted economies to advance in the value added and say, look, you need to go to technology, you need to go to microchips. The reality is, so far, I haven't seen any Chinese or Japanese or South Asian eating a watch or eating a cellular phone. They eat beef, they eat food products, where Paraguay is very, very competitive. So Paraguay has been expanding food production. I think today is one of the most important players in the world, because we are 4th largest exporter of soy in the world. We are the 6th largest exporter of beef in the world. We are ahead of countries like Argentina and Uruguay, which are markets that are well known and everybody can relate to the Argentinian beef. Well, Paraguay export more beef than Argentina. And the reality is that because this is a country that is very, very large, and you look at the map of South America, and it's very disguising, because apparently it's relatively small, but in reality, Paraguay is larger than Germany. But we have a population that is 1/10 of the population in Germany. So this is a very large territory with a very fertile land, with a lot of water. We are on top of the largest sweet basin of water in the world, the aquifer of Guarani. So there is absolutely no region in Paraguay where you cannot produce food, and we are very competitive in that regard. So the challenge is how to advance in the process of agro-industrialization. How can we provide more value added to what Paraguay? And you know what? We have a huge opportunity ahead of us, because also of producing food products, we also are the largest exporter of hydroelectric energy per capita in the world. We have the number one hydroelectric. We share that it's a binational institute with Brazil. Itaipu is the largest hydroelectric in the world. And we share another hydroelectric with Argentina. We only use 20% of all the energy that is available for Paraguay. So we are basically the only country in Latin America that has excess amount of clean renewable energy that is going to be very useful for the process of the industrialization of what? Of the food products that we have here in the country. So I think when we do a balance of risk for Paraguay, the upside risk is huge. We need to work on the downside, which is mostly on the social. We need to provide to this young population, because in fact, one of the greatest assets is our population. We have the youngest population in Latin America. 75% of the population is younger than 45 years old. This is a great asset, but it could also be a great liability if we don't provide the tools for those youth to insert to a very competitive job market.
Yes, totally. I was thinking two things, that maybe it's also a question of branding, right? Too, because it seems something very silly, but actually what you were mentioning about Argentina, I'm from Argentina, and when you say Argentina, everybody instantly associates you with beef. But actually, I didn't know that Paraguay exported much more than Argentina. So yes, it's a lot about marketing and branding on these days.
And in this, I think this is very important what you mentioned, Rosario, because when you think about the agricultural business or the cattle raising in Argentina, you can go back to more than 100 years. You can find in the province of Buenos Aires, people that came from Europe more than 100 years ago to produce soy. When you think about soy production in Paraguay or the cattle raising business, this is 20 years. 15 years. So it's the way, the improvement that we can make in the following years is huge. And of course, we have jumped 3 or 4 generations with the use of technology. And what happened in the South American cone is that a lot of soy producers from Argentina went from Argentina to Uruguay to buy land in Uruguay. And the Uruguayans who sold their land came to Paraguay to produce cattle raising. So the increase and the transfer of technology. So when you export beef or you export soy, you are not just exporting a raw material. You are producing technology. So the amount of research and development that is behind the increase in the productivity, going to areas where the rain is not as regular in another part, but thanks to technology, you can produce higher yields or more kilos of beef using less grass or less water. This is technology, this is research and development. I think this is something that we share with a country where you are now, Australia, who is way ahead of us in terms of the cattle raising business.
Yes, totally. Santiago, you mentioned, you talked about the hydroelectric energy. And actually, my next question is on that. In 2023, it will be renegotiated the Annex C of the Itaipu Treaty. It basically defines, let's tell the people, the financial and provisional basis of Itaipu's electricity services. So how do you think Paraguay will face this challenge and defend actually its rights and its interests, claiming the fair share that it has for being an equal partner of Brazil?
This is the greatest economic and political debate that we're facing in Paraguay. And for the audience to know a little bit about this, the treaty was signed 48 years ago. In 2023, it will be 50 years since the signing of the treaty. And the treaty said that the Annex C, which established the financial condition, established how the rate of electricity is set. He said that in 50 years' time can be renegotiated. The current tariff of electricity comprise three factors: the cost of production, the royalties that are sent to each part, to Paraguay and Brazil, and the debt service. The current tariff, 60% is the debt service. The debt will be completely paid out by August 2023, which is the 50th anniversary of the signing of the treaty. So we are facing this discussion in terms that we need to initiate negotiations with Brazil ahead of the August 2023, because by that time, the tariff will go down by 60%, which sounds very reasonable and very attractive. We all want cheaper electricity. But the problem is that Brazil use 80% of the electricity. So they will benefit not only with their 50% share, but they will also benefit with the 30% share that we don't use and we sell to them. So we are proposing, and this is something of a very open debate, that Paraguay should allow a decline in the tariff, but also should allow an increase in the royalties or the transfer to each country, so Paraguay could benefit of the part that is not using and is selling to Brazil. So this is a highly controversial issue, and of course, a lot of debate. Probably this has been for the last 50 years since the previous negotiations with Brazil, one of the most controversial political issues. This is very important to mention. The Itaipu Treaty and the construction of the hydroelectric was also not only a hydroelectric project, but also the way to solve a limit discussion with Brazil after the Triple Alliance war. So after the war, it was not clear where were the limits. And remember, we lost 60% of the territory. And this part of the country include the Saltos de Sete Quedas, which is it was at that time, a huge natural advantage of huge falls in that part of Paraguay. So Brazilians decided to build an hydroelectric, so the dams will completely underwater, so disappeared. So it was a way to solve that. And as you can imagine, today, Brazil GDP is almost 200 times the GDP of Paraguay. At that time, it was much bigger. So the difference in the weight, in the economic, political weight, it has been very, very large. For that reason, Paraguay, over the last couple of years, has also requested the international assistance of people who can raise their voice. One of them has been Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who have done a research study about the renegotiation and the different weights between Paraguay and Brazil. So the negotiation has not begun yet. Brazil, of course, wants to delay as much as possible. Paraguay has the intention to move as fast as possible, but we are also towards the end or the second half of the current administration of Paraguay. So we are a little bit living with a lame duck in terms of political power.
Thank you for that. Sorry. Thank you for that insight. I have a few follow-ups with a question about how Paraguay, the timing will be great to think about ways that Paraguay could leverage these changes that are occurring in its finance for energy as well. Paraguay stands to benefit in two ways, in that the cost of electricity production will get cheaper through the financing of the debt of the initial investment for the Itaipu Dam. Those costs will end in 2023. And not only that, but there's the opportunity to charge what Brazil buys from Paraguay to get some more economic benefit. I wanted to ask if how do you see these gains, these quite significant gains to the revenue of Paraguay, helping with what you were mentioning earlier with agro-industrialization? Are you going to see these broad effects, broad benefits occurring throughout the economy? Do you think electricity prices, those drops will be passed on to the consumer, or perhaps investment in infrastructure will follow?
Yeah, electricity for consumers, residential and industrial consumers, is the cheapest in Latin America. Is one of the cheapest in the world. So, of course, if you ask the consumer if they would like to have cheaper electricity, of course the answer would be yes, right? But I think the role of public policy is to do the best and maximize the benefit. So let's put the two extremes. On one side is we maintain the same rate of electricity. So the drop in the debt service will go 100% to each country. That represents to Paraguay an additional inflow of revenue of $1 billion. This is roughly 3% of GDP. So it's very important. This means doubling the amount of public investment per year. So this is a massive inflow of additional revenue, not needing to request a foreign financing. So in terms of public financing, this is great. This is one extreme. It's probably impossible to think about that because Brazil would like to reduce some of the cost of the electricity, but just to give an idea of the extremes. On the other extremes, they say that Brazil doesn't allow to maintain the tariff, and the tariff go down by 60%. For that, we need to do a massive investment, and this is something that is feasible. We could do an investment to expand the current electric grid and improve the capacity of the electric grid through better transmission and distribution line. And this means that Paraguay could add, 200, 300,000 jobs in the next couple of years. So that would create a lot of spillovers on, of course, more companies will come, more jobs will be created, and more taxes will generate it, and this will again generate revenues for the government. So either way, Paraguay will receive a lot of benefit. It's an upside risk. The challenge is how to negotiate the best with a country which in their mind, they think that Paraguay is just a guest in this project, not a partner, 50-50 partner, because they lead the project 50 years ago. They got the financing 50 years ago. So they feel that all the benefit now should go to the Brazilian consumer by reducing the cost of electricity. So I think these are the two extremes, how Paraguay could benefit. In both ways will benefit. The benefit to Paraguay will come. The challenge is how to maximize that benefit.
Do you expect headwinds or tailwinds from political changes in Brazil or in Paraguay? You have elections coming up in 2023, elections soon coming up in Brazil that will precede these renegotiations. I guess without diving too deep into the politics, do you expect this will make it more difficult, or you think there might be a favorable environment for renegotiation and looking forward?
Yeah, it seems a conflicting issue because I follow very closely Brazilian economic policy, and I think that the current administration has been very good for Brazil, but very bad for Paraguay. And the reality is that they have engaged much better than the government, the previous administration, with the private sector. So the incentive for industries to remain in Brazil has been larger with this administration. In the previous, before Bolsonaro, first with Lula and then with Dilma, there were good news for Paraguay. There were very good governments for Paraguay. In fact, Paraguay got a lot of benefits in the bilateral relation with Lula and then with Dilma. And they were not very eager in promoting industries in Brazil. So what could be good for Brazil is not necessarily good for Paraguay. So I expect if the poll shows today that Lula is winning the election, I think that would be a good news for Paraguay. Something similar happened in the case of Argentina. The best years of Paraguay were during the time of Cristina Fernandez, and before that, his husband, Nestor Kirchner. When President Macri came and he was doing a much more market-friendly economic policy, that was not necessarily good news for Paraguay. So, in fact, our price of export has been expanding in the last 2 years, and this is because Argentina has got more protectionist, and Brazil has got also promoting in a different way, right? Because Argentina has different issues than Brazil. I mean, so I think that going forward, if we look the current political situation in Brazil, and if it's true what Paul says, that Lula will be the next president, I think that would be great news for Paraguay and for the renegotiation of the Itaipu Treaty.
Great.
There is a lot to talk about in all these topics. It's like so much information and so many things to consider. But actually, now I would like to change a little bit the subject and go to the Mercado Común del Sur, or Mercosur. You were talking about Argentina, you were talking about Brazil. So Paraguay had the pro tempore presidency in 2020, and basically what they say is that they were aiming at an integrated bloc between the brother countries. And here comes maybe the controversial question. Do you believe that Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and Venezuela actually embrace that regional perspective that Paraguay was talking about?
Definitely not. I think that despite all the advancement that we have seen in the last 3 decades after the signing of the Mercosur, which was signed here in Asunción in 1991, we have done a lot of progress. But the reality is that the two largest economy, Brazil and Argentina, and I don't want to refer about Venezuela because that's a completely different case. It's a very particular case, and it's way behind the integration of the original Mercosur members. But the reality is that Argentina and Brazil has remained very, very protectionist. They have a mindset that is protectionist, and it's very reasonable. There are two large economies with large populations, so they would rather look at inside than looking outside. But I think when we talk about bilateral free trade agreement with the EU, it is clear that the EU will rather negotiate with the Mercosur than negotiate with Paraguay, Uruguay, or Argentina itself. So you mentioned the position of Paraguay, and it was also true in the previous government, in the previous pro tempore presidency in 2016. Paraguay moved ahead in the negotiation with the EU after 16 years. That negotiation was stalled for 16 years, and Paraguay was the one moving ahead and saying we need to advance in this negotiation. Not because we want to access the EU market, because Paraguay itself has already access to the EU market through an independent bilateral agreement that benefit less developed economies. But the reality is by negotiating the Mercosur with the EU will force Argentina and Brazil to also open their economy, which for Paraguay, there still are room for access. There are a lot of products that, despite being a part of Mercosur, we cannot enter. I'm going to mention one of them, the assembly of motorcycles. Paraguay has a huge market of motorcycles. We are very competitive. But every time we want to enter the Brazilian market, they bring a new regulation. No, you know, now the tire has to be this size, or the exhaust has to be this size. I mean, they promote the protection, and it's very good for them, but it's very bad for the integration. So we have been expanding the production of many products in Paraguay, but it has been very, very difficult. This is a tough neighborhood for economic integration. So I think that we still have a lot of room to improve, but we cannot think on any situation in where Paraguay does not belong to the Mercosur.
Do you think you could outline, if possible, some of the benefits that Paraguay does receive from being a part of Mercosur? If it like Uruguay, is benefits from more international trade and perhaps flexibilization of the agreement, despite the fact that it is in this international trade bloc, which is Mercosur. I think Mercosur, by some statistic, was it was 10th in the list of trade blocs when comparing intra-national trade versus trade outside of the bloc. So that said, what benefit does Mercosur bring to Paraguay if Paraguay and Uruguay and these countries are trying to reach more international agreements with places like Europe?
Yeah, I think there has been improvement in access to a market, and Mercosur gave the two smallest economy, Paraguay and Uruguay, some additional benefits. For example, we have a zero tax on outside of the region import of raw material. So if I'm an industry in Paraguay, in terms of plastic, for example, I can import capital goods at zero cost, zero tariff. So that allow me to be very competitive when I compete to the Argentinian industry or the Brazilian industry. So for import goods, for capital goods, and also for raw materials. So this is one of the benefits that we have, and of course, we can access for certain products. We can access the Brazilian and Argentinian market. The other benefit is that Uruguay and Paraguay has a tourist regime. What is the tourist regime? For a certain list of products, we can import these products and they can enter the Brazilian and Argentinian market at almost zero taxes. It's a very low tax. For example, 2% VAT and 1% import tariff. These products are mostly technology, alcohol beverages, also other high quality technology, high advanced quality products. So this is a very important market. This represents a large part of the revenues that Paraguay generate. And it's estimated that almost 20 million Brazilians cross the border every year to buy this product, mostly in the tri-border area. This is the part of Ciudad del Este, Foz de Iguazu, and Iguazu in the part of Argentina. So there's a lot of trade in that region thanks to this treaty. And of course, because Brazil and Argentina has a very high tax regime, and Paraguay, on the contrary, is a very low tax regime. The tax arbitrage is very large, and this generates a lot of positive inflows to Paraguay.
I think that's a good point of explaining how Paraguay, how would I put this? Paraguay stands to benefit from its arrangement in the middle of Mercosur, and even though it does seem to be squeezed a little bit by economic policies coming from either side of it, Brazil and Argentina, this island in the middle of South America can leverage its geographic position to its economic benefit, but also the benefit of the trade bloc as a whole. Do you expect the ratification of the EU Mercosur trade deal anytime soon, or do you think this will be kicked down the road a bit more internally by the politics of the countries of South America, or indeed Europe, which also has some opposition towards the deal?
Absolutely, and I think the later is the biggest challenge. I think there is no agreement among the EU members on this. So I think, Ariel, that still we have a long way before we can see it. But regarding your first part of the question of the background, this is a tough neighborhood, but has been a tough neighborhood for the last 200 years. So this has allowed Paraguay to build a quite resilient economy. Despite being a landlocked country, we have the third largest fleet of barges in the world after China and the Mississippi. 80% of all the trade go through the rivers. And these are, Paraguay, despite being landlocked, is surrounded by huge rivers that generate electricity, but also the highways for the goods to come in and come out. So we have a lot of opportunities. Some part of Brazil, for example, Mato Grosso do Sul, which is neighbor of Paraguay and is on the river, is more landlocked than Paraguay. So they need to use the waterway to also mobilize their production in that part of the northern part of Brazil. So I think that the process of integration to Brazil, to Argentina, and the rest of the world is only beginning. And again, this is a country that has maintained macro stability for decades. We have the same currency for the last 70 years. 70 years with the same currency. And you say, well, but this is very normal. No, it's not normal for countries in Latin America. In fact, we have the longest currency in South America after the peso in Colombia. And we are next to Argentina, who has taken 17 zeros to their currency over the same period of time. Cases of hyperinflation, the same happened in Brazil, Plan Austral, Plan Cruzado, Plan Real. All these plans were just modification of the currency, and this was because they were running very large deficit. They were financing those deficits with lending by the central bank by printing money, and that at the end make the economy very, very hard to work fine, and of course affecting the most vulnerable with the most regressive tax, which is inflation. So I think we have a very solid fundamentals. We need to build over those fundamentals. We need to make better use of our natural resources. And today we have much knowledge about the impact about the environment and how to make the agricultural production sustainable with the environment. It should not be against the environment. It has to be in line with the very sound policies to maintain the ecosystem. So I think Paraguay, by running behind other countries, can learn from the good experience and also avoid the bad experiences.
Yes, totally. Santiago, you have just mentioned that Paraguay has really strong fundamentals, and that's actually great. But in an interview with The Banker, you mentioned that the challenges of Paraguay actually were justice, corruption, and impunity in going forward, right? So, given that Paraguay is very high in a not good ranking, it's in the 137th position of the Corruption Perceptions Index. And with 28 points compared with the region that it's 43 points. And it's a region that we should say as Argentinians, as Latin Americans, it's really bad doing in corruption. How do you actually think that you could tackle this and that Paraguay can work towards transparency? Yes, I think this is a really important question to go forward, right? Because
no, absolutely. And we have, and I mentioned this, we have a lot of upside risk. We have downside risk. I think that the downside are in terms of the human capital. We have enormous challenges in improving the public health system and the public education system. And again, this is part of the history of Paraguay. We did an educational reform in the early 90s, which was the expansion of the public education system, right? And this type of reforms in South America took place in the 60s, in Argentina, probably in the 40s. So we are behind in that, in the policies that improve the quality of the education. We are doing that right now, and I think this will yield benefit. And the formation of human capital is also key to strengthen institutions in the country, public institutions, democratic institutions, political institutions. So corruption is an issue. But I don't think that corruption in Paraguay is larger or bigger than a problem the problems that are faced in Brazil, in Argentina, in Bolivia, in Colombia. What I do think is that we Paraguayans tend to have a more critical view about our own process of development. And the corruption perception index, as it names it, is a perception. A perception by who? By its own country. So the questions that are sent every year are sent to the same Paraguayan asking, how do you perceive corruption in your country? And we tend to see ourselves worse as other countries see themselves. When you ask, and I have done this with many investors in Paraguay, investors that run businesses in all countries in the region, I said, this is the paradise. If you can imagine the problem that I have to face trying to get a license in Bolivia or Argentina or Brazil, dealing with state legislation, with the municipalities, with the department authorities and the national authorities, is much more complex. And corruption works in every part of the world. So I think that we need to continue to improve. I think we have an opportunity in the use of technology in all the process regarding the public sector and dealing with the corruption. We are doing that. We are advancing in digitalizing the public sector. This will cut off a lot of the bureaucracy that tend to be a cost at the end. And the other factor is that, and we have seen also the experience of other countries in the region, for example, the doing business. This is an index, right? And most of the countries has beaten the index. They have just decided, okay, how many days do you need to open a company? Oh, let's put it that we do it in 1 day. But how many companies are open in 1 day, right? So, and in that regard, I think that Paraguay is still a very ingenuous country. We comply with everything. We don't tend to make any trick on all this index. So I think that we also need to understand how these processes are built. We need to see ourselves in a way that we are able to be very rigorous with ourselves, but also compare with other countries in the region, right? Because otherwise we are punishing Paraguay, and at the end we are putting ourselves in a position that when you compare with other countries in the region, I can assure you, and investors who are doing business in Paraguay can assure you that Paraguay does not belong to the position that it is currently. And also in that regard, when we issue the first bond in the international market in 2013, the rating on Paraguay bonds, also on the sovereign rating of Paraguay, was very, very low. And there was no way to challenge this with the rating agencies because there were no interest rate to compare with other countries. For the moment that Paraguay started issuing bonds in the international market, we can have a reference that is given by international investors about the risk perception about Paraguay, which is a more broad-based analysis. So currently, Paraguay is not an investment-grade country, but has been issuing debt at the same rate that other countries, which are investment grade, are issuing. So our rating is behind what the market is already telling that Paraguay, due to the macro stability, the independent management of the monetary policy, and the sustainability of the fiscal account, will give to Paraguay. So I think this is part of the process of internationalizing the Paraguayan economy, but also doing a better job in how to present the case of Paraguay with the strengths, but also with the challenges.
Okay, perfect. So yes, I think that what you were trying to say is basically that Paraguayan people are really rigorous with themselves compared with other countries. That, for example, in Argentina, we actually know ourselves so much that sometimes it's hard to go through our, not strengths, but yeah. Anyway, I think that's an interesting point of view. Of course, there are things to work in all the region, and regarding that, maybe you talk about Argentina, Brazil. Bolivia, and all the corruption that it's in the whole region. So then, would you say that international cooperation could play a role in facing this regional problem, or do you actually believe that it's something that each country should tackle by themselves?
No, international cooperation is always very useful, particularly because more and more we are seeing that the crime and the corruption that is, or the crime that fits in the corruption is becoming more and more multinational businesses. And crimes in the region has been able to integrate more and have a multi-country platform. So if we want to be successful in fighting corruption and crimes, this should be multinational efforts. And we have done improvement in this regard with Argentina, with Brazil. We have a lot of dry frontier, right? We have a lot of rivers, but also we have a lot of dry frontier. So you can just literally walk from one street to the other and you are in Paraguay or Brazil, right? So, and there are not customs. In the case of Ciudad del Este and Foz de Iguazú, because of an agreement between the two countries, you can move around 50 kilometers area without need to do customs, right? Or immigration. So it's very easily, and this is part of Mercosur itself, but it's also easy for the smuggling of products, for counterfeiting products. So this put also a huge challenges for Paraguay. So basically, international cooperation and multi-country efforts are a must. But the truth is, you need to have a leadership, a local leadership, to lead the effort, right? This is something that should be a priority from the top of all the institutions, from parliament, from the presidency of the republic, and of course, the judiciary. During the time I was Minister of Finance, I engaged a lot in improving the legislation and the application of the legislation with the parliament, but also with the judiciary, in terms that we were prosecuting people for tax evasion, right? And these trials were taking forever. And so at some point, I went to the Supreme Court and said, look, you need resources to expand the coverage of the judiciary system, right? Yeah, we need more money. You are actually asking me more money. Well, you know, you have under your jurisdiction to penalize and to charge penalties for tax evasions. So if you can help me, I can help you expanding the judiciary system, right? So this is something that they didn't understand. They thought, okay, let's just ask more resources or more financing to the presidency. Where does the money come from? The money comes from taxes. So if you have a lot of tax evaders, you cannot collect all the resources for the public sector. So it takes a lot of dialogue. It takes a lot of also trying to sensibilize about how this process goes and how they retroaliments among all institutions.
Thank you for that, Santiago. I'd like to change topic almost completely to a more international idea. I'm fascinated by the fact that Paraguay is unique in the international community for maintaining diplomatic relations with Taiwan, the Republic of China, over the People's Republic of China. Australia's relations with Taiwan are at a sub-ambassadorial level. For those interested, particularly us Australians, can you explain why Paraguay takes that position? What does it mean for Paraguay to take this position?
Yeah, despite that Paraguay is a small economy, very open, so we need to trade a lot. It's a country that, despite all the improvement in recent years on economic indicators, still one of the countries with the lowest GDP per capita. It has to improve a lot in social indicators. But we are a society that really value democratic institutions. We suffer from the dictatorship of 35 years, but on top of the dictatorship, the political instability even before the dictatorship, was very bad for Paraguay. So we really value democracy, and we value relations with countries that also value the same institution, democratic institution that we value. So our bond with Taiwan is not based in economic interest. It's based on the valuation that we do about the democracy and how this institution benefit society and the well-being and the freedom of the persons. So we have maintained for more than 60 years this relation with Taiwan, and I can assure you that despite the rising of China and all the pressure that China has put on Paraguay in access their market for the beef export or the delivery of vaccines during the pandemic, Paraguay has remained very solid about the relation with Taiwan. I think that Paraguay has a lot to learn from Taiwan, the same way it has a lot to learn from a country like Israel, where we maintain very close ties. In fact, in the previous administration, Paraguay was the first country to move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, something that was highly recognized by the state of Israel. And we also can learn from a country like South Korea, that 50 years ago was a country with a lower GDP per capita than Paraguay. Those three countries share something very similar to Paraguay. They are next to a very large and complicated country. So we can learn a lot from Taiwan, from its relation with China. We can learn a lot from South Korea, from its relation with North Korea. And we can learn a lot from Israel, surrounded by its enemies. So I think that what is behind this strong tie with Taiwan is based on the evaluation about the democratic institution, about their legacy, their history, but more importantly about their shared future that we can build together.
That is truly a fascinating perspective, this idea of international or national empathy that Paraguay relates to countries like Taiwan and Israel and South Korea. But there are a lot of democracies around the world that still, they take this more pragmatic approach towards the recognition of the Republic of China or the People's Republic of China. And is this a discussion that occurs internally within Paraguay, this idea of should we be pragmatic, think about how to maintain relations with both at some kind of level, or whether we should put more of an emphasis on economic weight of the People's Republic of China? Does Paraguay manage this issue internally? And do you think there's something that Australia can learn about how Paraguay manages its international affairs, particularly related to this question?
Yeah, I think that at some point China will solve their issues with Taiwan. If you think about the largest manufacturer of cell phones in the world, this is a Taiwanese company, which is the largest investors in China. So if you think about the amount of flights per day between Taipei and Chengdu, I think it's the city, I think there are 50 flights per day. So the amount of trade that they have, and they have been very pragmatic in that regard. So I have no doubt that at some point this would also happen with the relations that Taiwan holds with the rest of the world. And China will understand, right? I understand that for China, it's not only Taiwan, it's also the Tibet and other parts of China, which are also claiming some kind of independence. So I understand their fights, and I know that if there is something that they have, is the measure about the time is much longer than what we have. I mean, when I talk about the history of Paraguay, I'm talking about 200 years. When they talk about history, they talk about the last 5,000 years. So they know how to manage times and building those relations. So I hope that at some point they will be able to solve. I am very optimistic that Paraguay will hold this relation with Taiwan. And more importantly, I think that we have also witnessed what has happened with other countries in South America and Latin America in particular. I have seen the experience of Costa Rica and also the experience of Panama, which is probably the latest case in changing its relation from Taiwan to China. And I haven't seen a huge improvement in the bilateral trade between Panama and China. I was recently in Ecuador, and Ecuador is probably the largest exporter of bananas in the world, and China is one of the largest market, and they were telling me all the problems that they have to enter the market, and so it's quite difficult. I try to, if you ask me, I rather think about Paraguay being very competitive in producing products that China values. For example, soy. The largest exporter of Paraguayan soy is a Chinese company, COFCO. So when you look about the imports of Paraguay, I think that the largest country where we import is China. So there is already a lot of trade, and this is something that we live with. On the other side, our relation with Taiwan has been expanding in terms of beef export. We are now the #1 market of beef for Taiwan. So this is something very positive. We have a very strong relation in human capital. Taiwan has put a university here in Paraguay for the training of engineers, something that has been in our agenda for many years. I hope that at some point Paraguay will be able to assemble iPhones in Paraguay. It's a Taiwanese company. So what do we need? We need engineers. So we asked a couple of years ago to the president of Taiwan, In Wen, to put in Paraguay the MIT from Taiwan in Paraguay. So bringing the brains from teachers in Taiwan to teach Paraguay. So they spend 2 years here, the initial training, and then they spend 2 years in Taiwan. We have by now 400 students training in those countries in engineering, in informatic engineer, technology engineer. So those are the youth of Paraguay that will insert in a much more competitive economy.
Thank you so much for that. Sorry.
Ask him about this question?
Yes. Go for it, Rosario.
No, go ahead. Yes, I didn't know about this, but actually I think it's really good for education and just still promoting the relationship, not only in commercial ways, but also in sharing.
Rosario, sorry. I went to Taiwan 20 years ago when I was still a student. I spent 1 month doing a training on small and medium enterprises. Mm-hmm. So this is something that they have done massively. Training, education, there has been a lot. So this is one particular project. But there has been, I don't know, at least 5,000 Paraguayans that went for PhD programs, master's degree, bachelor's, or just short-term training in Taiwan. So we think that this is the bet that we need to do for the coming years. So I just wanted to add that.
No, totally. That's amazing. I think that's really great. That's what we actually have. Argentina has with Australia, and a lot of countries has with Australia. And that's one question that I would also like to ask you regarding the bilateral relations that Australia and Paraguay have. How do you think that that these relations are actually you share international perspectives? There is beneficial cooperation between both of us, but actually the trade market is not really big. Which do you think? Do you think there is a potential for investment? And how do you think that this bilateral relation could improve in the future?
I think there is a world of opportunities. And we haven't not even begun to explore those opportunities. In 2015, when I just took over the Ministry of Finance, based on my own experience, I graduated as an economist here in Paraguay, and I went to Colombia thanks to a scholarship provided by the government of Japan. At that time, Paraguay did not have any scholarship programs for postgraduate studies. So based on my own experience, because I remember going to Colombia and having classmates from Argentina, from Colombia, Peru, and they were all coming with scholarship from the country, and the sense of belonging was very, very strong, right? So based on my own experience, I launched the largest export scholarship program in the history of Paraguay after Carlos Antonio Lopez. Carlos Antonio Lopez was the first constitutional president of Paraguay after its independence in 1840. And he promoted the human capital formation abroad. So he brought engineers from abroad. He invested a lot. And remember, this was before the war, the Triple Alliance. But that time, or 10 years after its government, Paraguay was the most advanced economy in South America. We had the first steam train in South America, only 10 years after the Queen of England inaugurated the one in England. So at that time, before the war, and was one of the reasons why Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay wanted Paraguay to literally disappear, because Paraguay was challenging the leadership of all these countries in the region, right? So I took the experience of Paraguay from 150 years ago and said, we need to launch a scholarship program. So we allocated resources from the budget, and we built a program that will promote the highest human capital formation. We said, look, you will be receiving a full scholarship from the government if you are accepted in one of the top 50 universities in the world. And I was amazed, all the Paraguayan students that went to study to Australia. I think before that, there were almost non-Paraguayan going to study Australia, but thanks to the very good quality of the education in Australia, a lot of Paraguayans, I don't have the number on the top of my head, but I can assure you that at least 100 Paraguayans went in the last 5 years to study a master's or PhD in Australia. So I'm sure that those Paraguayans are going to bring a lot of the Australian culture, economy, and will integrate and will be doing business in Australia in the next couple of years. So the other part is that we are economies that we can learn a lot from each other. I mean, in cattle raising, Australia is way ahead of Paraguay. We have a very large extension of territory that still can be used for cattle raising or the agricultural sector. So I think that we can learn a lot, and why not thinking about Australian companies that come to Paraguay and benefit of the location, the attractive tax regime, the abundance of electricity, clean renewable electricity. So I'm sure that there's a lot to do in that regard. I feel ashamed that I haven't been in Australia. I went all over the world. I visit almost every country in the world, but I haven't been in Australia so far. So maybe this could be the initiation for a closer relation between Paraguay and Australia.
A good excuse.
Yes.
Excuse me. And also, I was thinking that maybe another coincidence that you were mentioning is that both are large countries that actually had a small population for the amount of territory that they have. So maybe that's another thing. And when you go through it and you study the realities of all the countries, you can find a lot of coincidences. It's so weird that maybe we are not in the panorama of all the regions, but there are a lot of things to work together.
No, absolutely, and we always talk about the South-South cooperation. I think that this is a nice word, but we haven't done much. I think there's a lot to do, and because of our historical roots with Europe, we tend to have a lot of relations with Spain, with France, with Italy, and Argentina is an example of this. But I think that we need to embark on this process of how to integrate more the South American region with Australia. I think that there's a lot to learn from each other and to build in this process of integrating more the world. I think that the world is getting smaller and smaller, and there's a lot to learn from each other. I'm a huge fan because I played rugby when I was younger. So, of course, we all follow the Australian national team.
Absolutely. I think we would absolutely love to have you build these South-South relations. There's less and less of an excuse for Australians to not visit Paraguay, and for you, Santiago, not to visit us. Come see our rugby team, and we'll be able to learn more about our cultures. It's important to emphasize just people-to-people links, not just these economic benefits that we can have. But wrapping up now, thank you so much for your time today. It was very interesting, an enriching dialogue that helped us deepen our knowledge of Paraguay. I think the message that I'm getting from this is that Paraguay sort of historically has been unfairly held back in its place, in its ability to leverage its strengths in the center, at the heart of South America, with its abundant natural resources, its young people, its resilient population, and its ability to bounce back, I think is so important. And these next few years are going to be very exciting and potentially very beneficial for Paraguay as we get into a post-pandemic situation. We have these developments with the cost of electricity and its relations with other countries. So thank you so much. And for everyone that is watching, please stay tuned. We will continue with more online dialogues for our Emergente series. And stay safe. So thank you so much, Santiago and Rosario.
It has been a pleasure. Thank you very much, Rosario, Ariel. I really enjoyed this interview, and I'm looking forward to continue to engage with you. Thank you very much.